Goes. Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for a convenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We're now exploring more West Africa, and I believe the country we will be exploring today is yet another former French colony, but I'm sure a neo-colony country, and we will be exploring the country of Gabon. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion, the brilliant historian, journalist, and activist, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, and also frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, who will be our guide on this trip to Gabon's history and current affairs. So, Abayomi, welcome back to the program.
Welcome to all our audience, and thank you once again for your continued interest in African affairs.
Oh, as always, it's an honor and real privilege to have you on as our history teacher, Abayomi, so all my thanks and appreciation as well. And just before we begin, as always, folks, please donate generously to Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report, and please donate generously if you can to 1+1. Share all of our contents, past and present. Help us overcome the far-right algorithms and help us overcome the monopoly that Western corporate media and state media has in the social media world by sharing widely all of 1+1's content and, again, donating to us. And now, on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us what was Gabon like before French colonization, and what was it like during French colonization, and what are some of the still awful legacies of French colonization that the people of Gabon are still having a hard time overcoming?
Yeah, well, first of all, there were African civilizations that existed in that region prior to the intervention of the Portuguese, the British, and the French, as well as the Germans, because some of these territories do have close proximity to all of these other colonial powers, and even the U.S. Church, who sent missionaries to the region as well during the 19th century. Prior to the intervention of France as a colonial power, you had, as I mentioned, traditional African societies. You had the Twa people, the Batwa, the so-called pygmies, as they were labeled by the Europeans.
Yeah.
There was also the Fang people who developed a civilization in the region that is just north of the ancient Kingdom of Congo. We've talked a lot about the Kingdom of Congo. Having made connections with Portugal and later, of course, Belgium. And this is a similar situation that occurred with Gabon. We have to remember that these demarcation lines were drawn by the European imperialist powers. A lot of them prior to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, others after that historic conference. So we have to think about these areas in a different light in terms of their being contiguous, but at the same time, prior to the intervention of colonialism, a lot of these countries, which we know today as modern African states, have in fact at one point been merged or part of civilizations that were either united or who worked in alliance with each other. So the civilization, the Luango culture and civilization was north of the Kingdom of Congo. And at the same time, it is reported that there was many similarities in terms of language, culture, and also cooperation between the two kingdoms. Now, they were discovered by the Portuguese between the 16th and 19th centuries. And I don't want to say discovered. They were discovered by the Europeans because they existed centuries and centuries before, even millenniums before. And you had today in those civilizations of Luango and Congo and others, Today, it constitutes modern day Republic of Congo, northern Angola, parts of Gabon, as well as Equatorial Guinea. So we have to understand, all of these variations of African historical periodization, I would like to call it. There were advanced civilizations that existed in that region prior to the advent of Portugal, France, and Britain. One was known as the Mandingo Cais. Very limited amount of writing has been done on this human settlement, but it's obvious that they were there long before the French and the Portuguese and the British entered that particular territory. Some of the most detailed accounts of Gabon were written in English by a British man by the name of Andrew Battelle. And he was captured and arrested by the British and held in their custody for many years. And during that time period, he wrote on his observations of what was going on in West Central Africa, particularly among the Luango people of that particular region. So people can still read his writings today.
Why was he incarcerated?
The French.
Why was he incarcerated?
There were conflicts and conflicts of interest between the British and the Portuguese that went back centuries. And even the first Africans that were brought to the United States is reported during the 1619. We just commemorated the 400th anniversary 6 years ago, were initially captured by the Portuguese, and that ship was raided, and they were taken then into custody of the British. That's how they wound up in the colony of Virginia in 1619. So throughout the centuries, there's been these conflicts between various European imperialist powers. Nonetheless, France did get the upper hand, and they set up a protectorate in the late 1830s in the area now known as Gabon, somewhere between 1838 and 1841. That continued. You had other French explorers, for example, Pierre Brazza, who we talked about, have been talking about for several weeks. The capital of Congo, Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, is named after him. And these people were, of course, very, very vicious in their approach. It was a divide and rule strategy against the various ethnic groups and cultures and civilization. And this continued all the way through the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century. I mentioned between 1838 and 1841, Gabon was made a protectorate. And then later, of course, in 1885, between 1885 and 1903, they were taken over completely and administered from Paris. So that just gives you some idea of the whole process of colonization and the removal of indigenous authority. Now, Gabon was heavily impacted by the Atlantic slave trade, negatively impacted, just like Congo was.
Okay.
And it led to a lot of dislocation as well as depopulation. Today, the population of Gabon is only about 2.5 million people. So it's quite surprising if you compare it to other areas in the region. For example, the Democratic Republic of Congo has many more people, well over 100 million people. And we talked about the Central African Republic last week. They have well over 20 million, about 23, 24 million people. But Gabon is heavily characterized by the rainforests. And of course, petroleum was discovered there in later years, and we can talk about that later. But yes, France took over the country. They established it as part of the French Equatorial Africa, which consisted of many of today's former French colonies. So that's what was happening up until the beginning of the 20th century.
Fascinating. And And that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is how did Gabon become independent, and was it a peaceful transition, or was it one of violent struggle?
Because of the disruptions caused by the Atlantic slave trade, the imposition of French colonial rule, there was rebellions that took place. There was resistance that occurred to the onslaught of French colonialism. During the 1920s, the first known political party was formed. It was known as Jeunesse Gabonais, and it was started in the 1920s. It was heavily anti-colonial, but according to most historical accounts, it was not necessarily anti-French in the sense that they did not reject the French language or anything like that. But this party was started during the 1920s. And then the struggle at that particular time period was largely centered around reform of the French colonial system. Now, this didn't really occur until after the occupation of France by Germany in 1940. We talked about this as well over the last several weeks.
Yeah.
In 1944, of course, there was the conference in Brazzaville, and Brazzaville was one of the outposts of so-called Free France. And that was the faction of the French ruling class which opposed Hitler, opposed the Vichy government in France, and ostensibly led the resistance to the German occupation.
And
And then there
De-Gaulle
was that
was
conference in 1944.
and De-Gaulle was a very important historical figure in that
Exactly.
movement, where they were trying where they basically were trying to reform the French Empire, but still but still maintain the fact that it's a French Empire. Correct.
Exactly. The conference of 1944, so-called Free French conference that took place in Brazzaville in 1944, did institute reforms, which led, to the establishment of local governing authorities. Some people were allowed to go to France to represent the African colonies in the so-called Fourth Republic. But then, of course, in 1958, De Gaulle came up with a scheme because they knew they would not be able to hold on to their colonies in perpetuity. We saw what happened in Vietnam in 1954 when the French were defeated miserably at Dien Bien Phu. They were under the impression that they could come in after regaining their imperial status after World War II. They assumed they could go into Vietnam and crush the resistance of the Viet Minh. That did not happen. They suffered a horrendous defeat. And they negotiated that they would, of course, allow elections to take place throughout Vietnam to unite the country and foster independence. Well, that didn't happen. They turned over a lot of their responsibility to the United States. The U.S. blocked, the holding of elections. And then, of course, in 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy began to send in advisors to Vietnam, South Vietnam, under the guise of they're just advising the local anti-communist South Vietnamese government. And of course, we know what happened between 1961 and 1965. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. In 1965, Johnson sent in hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, and they stayed there for another decade until they were run out in 1975, 50 years ago. But the point I'm making is that France knew that militarily they could not defeat many of these African colonies. In the same year that they were defeated in Vietnam in 1954, the National Liberation Front of Algeria launched their armed struggle against French colonial rule in Algeria, which had existed since 1830. So they came up with this scheme. It's a classic neo-colonial scheme from the standpoint that they wanted to allow autonomy on the part of their African colonies in exchange for greater political participation, reforms, economic opportunities, and so forth. That was in 1958 when De Gaulle came up with that proposal. And all the various African colonies were able to vote on this. And Guinea-Conakry, under the Democratic Party of Guinea, was the only colony at that time to vote against it. They rejected it, and they were declared independent in October of 1958. So they struck out on their own. So Gabon, the people there ostensibly voted in favor of the French proposal for the establishment of this Fifth Republic. Now, in doing that, they remained within the French colonial framework. However, this did not work well over the next 2 years, and with the mass struggles for national liberation all over Africa, in 1960, the French said, okay, go ahead, hold your elections, declare your independence, and this is what happened. So in 1960, they were declared independent, and the party that became dominant was headed by a man by the name of Leon Mba, and he was a person that advocated democracy, but there were problems politically between 1960 and 1964. In 1964, some lower-ranking military officers attempted to overthrow Mba.
Yes,
and that was reversed.
A 1964 coup. Talk about that and the rollback against the 64 coup, the coup attempt in Gabon, and what was the aftermath of that?
Well, the French, stepped in and helped reverse the coup. And this same pattern has continued over the successive decades, where if the neo-colonial dominated governments in Gabon get in trouble, France, which has troops there, just deploys them to reinstitute the government that they have been supporting. So that's what happened in 1964. Yeah. And that continued. And then, of course, in 1967, Mba died, and a man by the name of Bongo took over after his death. And of course, that was a watershed moment in Gabonese history, because between 1967 all the way up to 2023, the leader, Bongo, and later his son controlled the politics of Gabon. So we're talking about something that occurred over 50 years, a period of over 5 decades. You had one family, which is pretty much a dynasty, that controlled the entire country of Gabon. So this is really an amazing situation. One of the longest, probably the longest ruling leader on the African continent since the post-independence period.
So then, is it safe to say, after the 1964 coup, what was Gabon's place in the Cold War and its relations with the U.S., France, and their English and Francophone allies in the collective West? Is one of basically very much close ties with France, the U.S., and their allies, so answer that, and then my follow-up question is its relations. What was Gabon's relations with the USSR, China, and the Eastern Bloc nations?
Well, it was clearly a very pro-Western government from the time of independence, up until today. Actually, the anti-French sentiment has increased over the last several years, in line with what has been going on in other former French colonies, for example, in Sahel, even outside of the Alliance of Sahel states. In Chad, there's reports that they have asked the French military to leave. Same situation in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as Senegal. Gabon, there were rumors last year that they were asking the French troops to leave. We have to see how this unfolds because elections were just held. But yes, to answer your question, it's clearly a pro-French and pro-Western regime that has existed there since 1958 and also since 1960 when it actually became independent.
And,
Also,
and
it's important to note that
yeah.
in 2022, some 3 years ago, they had applied and were admitted to the Commonwealth, which is controlled from London. Even though they are a former French colony, they were admitted to the Commonwealth.
Interesting. And in fact, I even have a very interesting question about that,
Okay.
which is actually my last one. So, but then, okay, so it's safe to say, so Gabon was essentially a one-party state, and this party, despite its authoritarianism, was not one. Okay, so it's safe to say that this one-party state was not one like Gaddafi of Libya or the Baathists under Hafiz Assad and later Bashar al-Assad, or Cuba under Fidel Castro, or Tanzania or Eritrea, both democratic socialist regimes in their own respective rights, that trying to address the majority poor, it's working class people, but that when it comes to Gabon, this was a one-party state that more or less did the bidding of its extremely tiny rich people whose solidarity is with Western capitalists, imperialists, and neo-colonialists, correct?
Exactly. And during the late 1980s, there was a decline in the economy there due to the dropping of petroleum prices. The country is a large-scale producer of oil. So, and they have a small population. So, from a statistical standpoint, they're considered one of the wealthiest countries on the African continent. They're considered a middle income country, even though the overwhelming majority of the people still live in poverty. But with the economic decline in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were mass demonstrations that broke out demanding multi-party democracy. And this happened in other former French colonies on the continent during the early 1990s as well. So that year, there were mass demonstrations, there were rebellions in the capital of Libreville, and also in a place called Port Gentil, which is another urban area. And the government did agree to hold a national conference on and develop a new constitutional framework for multi-party democracy. That's what came out in 1990. I just wanted to mention that Brazzaville, which became the capital of Gabon, was a city that was formed by people who had been, quote, liberated, unquote, by the French from a slave ship, series of slave ships. The British and the French claimed they were against the Atlantic slave trade beginning around the early part of the 19th century.
Yeah.
In fact, they outlawed the Atlantic slave trade during the first decade of the 1800s in order to institute a more rational form of labor exploitation and land excavation.
Yes, exactly.
And that was colonialism, classical colonialism. Yeah. So it wasn't that they were for the liberation of African people, not at all. They just wanted a more rational system for managing labor and for extracting resources. But Brazzaville, some of their initial inhabitants were people who had been liberated from a slave ship during the 19th century. But there were this conference, they agreed to have multi-party elections, but still, because of the dominant role of the Bongo family, which was backed by France and the other imperialist countries, despite the fact that there were numerous elections that were held during the 1990s and even in the 2000s, the same Gabonese Democratic Party that's dominated by the Bongo family continued to win these elections. There were elections in the 1990s, even in the 2000s, this occurred. So probably the most contested one was in 2016 when Sean Ping, who had been the chairperson of the African Union Commission during the 20 teens, he was the commission chair when the Pentagon and the CIA and NATO bombed Libya back to the Stone Age in 2011. He had tried to negotiate some type of truce between NATO and the Jemahariya. In fact, Gaddafi and the Jemahariya government had agreed to reforms. They had agreed to hold multi-party elections inside the country, but it was totally rejected by the Obama administration and the French presidency of the person who was in power at that particular time, who in fact was found guilty of corruption because he had taken money from Libya to run his campaign prior to the destruction
Yes,
of the country.
Nicolas Sarkozy, who I
Yeah,
often call the
Sarkozy.
yes, who of all of the French, political, leaders, ex-presidents and whatnot, I have a particularly physical disgust for Sarkozy. And often in conversations with my parents, I often call him the butcher of Libya. And he should always be known as the butcher of
Mm-hmm.
Libya. And even if
Right.
he never ever spends a day in jail, and he should be spending the rest of his life in jail, both in
Yes.
France and in The Hague, and I think also in Libya and Syria as well.
Mm-hmm.
The best, for me, the best punishment for an egomaniac like that is if he's barred from politics for life in France, which would be a
Mm-hmm.
nice, blow to his ego, because that's what these people live on is elections, going on the televisions, and then getting elected, and then raining death and destruction on everybody. So
Yeah,
that's
I
really
remember. Wasn't he the interior minister during the rebellions back? It was, back
yes.
during the period of 2000s in the 2000s, and he referred to the black people from North Africa and from the Caribbean and other parts of Africa as social scum who were involved in these rebellions, and they were a direct result of police misconduct and poverty and racial discrimination. So
Oh
that shows
yes.
the
Oh,
type
and
of person
he said
that he
more than
is.
that. He said
Mm-hmm.
more than that. Now, I don't know exactly word for word how you translate the statements he made,
Right.
but he basically described them as scum, and that he wanted to basically vacuum clean them, that he wanted to clean the scum out and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, and that's a perfect yeah. So he was a very well known dog whistler, and very much, even by French right wing standards, Sarkozy was always considered
Yes.
to be very much on the very right spectrum in France, both in terms of wanting more business friendly policies, and also tough on crime and so forth. And that was actually one of the uh, one of the reasons why he got elected. And I think it was actually and I think it was sort of the beginning of France going down a very scary right wing direction. And when we talk about Gabon, when we talk about the '90s in Gabon, you've already described how Gabon was like in the '90s, but let me just mention the following. So. Yes, so we come to the '90s. Multi-party democracy is introduced to Gabon. However, the country that has the party that has ruled Gabon more or less since independence, and that is the Gabonese Democratic Party. Even when democracy is supposedly introduced, four democratically elected presidents come from the GDP, and this party and what has made and this party has made Gabon sadly in, sadly very much a right wing country, and like Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Egypt, Gabon is being led by the GDP is not good news for the majority poor population. The GDP is a member of the centrist Democrats International, which is where many right leaning Christian Democrats and centrist parties who lean to the economic right. So, fiscally conservative or neoliberal, but supposedly socially liberal and tolerant of minorities and other historically marginalized groups, but very right wing to its core. And the GDP itself, it's one of fiscal and very socially conservative parties. Economic liberalism, which is, which in the African or post-colonial world is neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Its Pan-Africanism is very much to the right, and it's very pro-French, which means it come, which means it believes in very strong economic ties to French capitalism, neo-colonialism, and
Exactly.
France's imperialism sphere of influence. And the GDP, they are centered to far right, very much influenced by the French model. Except when we talk about France and France's right wing, unlike the British, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian right wing, do give a lot of concessions to its working class and bourgeoisie. It's why De Gaulle was supported for many years. It's why De Gaulle was even supported by the French Communist Party, who did not support the May 1968 riots. It's the anniversary of that. And it's even
Right.
why some unions and even left leaning folk supported Chirac throughout his time in office. But the egalitarianism and the social class harmony between the socio-economic classes in France all ends when it comes to imperialism. So Abayomi, tell us about Gabon's place in world affairs and its domestic affairs in the 90s, where the Cold War has ended. And feel free to talk about how Gabon fares in the early 2000s.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just to mention that uh, no, Albert Bernard, who was also known as Omar Bongo, was the founding member of the Bongo dynasty, and he died in 2009 after, many times being reelected as president. There were rumors circulating about his health and is he all right and so forth. And eventually it came out that he had died. The government didn't say anything, but eventually they had to announce that he had died. And then that's how his son, Ben Ali Bongo, came to office in 2009. And he, of course, all the elections that were held there, he won. Even the most recent one uh, in 2023. And people immediately rejected his reelection in 2023. And then, of course, they moved in and overthrew him, led by the military officer in Guema, who in fact was elected president just recently. Yes, but the economy was doing very poorly, even though they're one of the largest oil producers on the African continent. They have a relatively small population. They bring in people, migrant laborers, to work in the petroleum industry and other sectors of the economy. So a lot of the unrest that took place during the 1990s was a result of the problems associated with the CFA French monetary zone, which other countries were also involved in as well. So it created a lot of economic turmoil in the former French colonies during the 1990s, even leading up to the Rwanda genocide in 1994. So yes, there were problems during the 1990s, unrest, but at the same time, they were able to maintain their grip on the body politic inside of Gabon up until approximately 2 years ago when they were overthrown. So we'll have to see, where the country is going to go now, since they have elected a president who is not part of the Bongo dynasty. What is this leader, Oligui Nguema, going to actually do to reverse the situation inside of Gabon? That is the
And
question that the people there are facing.
what were the conditions that led to Gabon, which, like Senegal, Kenya, Botswana, Tanzania, Gabon, for a long time enjoyed this reputation of being a fairly stable country, or at least that's the image they've successfully
Right.
cultivated. So, what were the conditions that led to the ruling Gabon Democratic Party and democracy itself to be ousted in a military coup in 2023? And what has been the situation, if there is any, in Gabon right now? And how do you assess the coup military government in Gabon presently?
A lot of it had to do with the fact that you still have a lot of poor people inside the country, even though a lot of money is being made off the petroleum industry, and the lack of distribution of the national wealth created tensions. And then the repeated undemocratic process that was utilized during the periods of elections, which always resulted in the PDG coming back to power. So I think there was a lot of popular support for the coup that took place in 2023. And since that time period, uh, there seems to be a very stable atmosphere inside the country politically. How long this will remain, who knows? Who knows? Because with all the turmoil that's going on in the world today, a lot of geopolitical regions will be subject to unrest, whether it's mass demonstrations, rebellions, and even possibly other military coups d'etats.
And even possibly counter revolutionary
Exactly.
coups that can come about. So
Yeah, that's
then,
my main concern in the AES countries, because AFRICOM, headed by Michael Langley, has already attacked Ibrahim Traore, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso. He has reiterated his attack just recently. So, yes, the U.S. definitely has their eye on trying to destabilize Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three countries whose militaries were closely allied with AFRICOM up until 5 years ago. In respect to Mali, they trained a lot of the officers who in turn staged coups d'etats that were anti-French and anti-US. So it just goes to show that despite the fact that the US is spending a lot of money, a lot of resources, they're deploying troops, they're engaging in military maneuvers in Africa, but at the same time, there's no guarantee that these same offices, these same governments, and the same people, particularly the masses of working people, farmers, and youth, and intellectuals and cultural workers, will not in turn become staunch enemies of the United States. We've seen this happen historically, and I believe it will continue to happen in the future.
and that's very interesting. And then a final question I wanted to ask about Gabon and its relations with other African countries is Paul Kagame welcomed the coup in 2023. Now, if one takes Paul Kagame's words and some of his actions,
Right.
he Kagame likes to give the image and the impression that he is pretty anti-French, and he's been exploiting, it seems, the wave of anti-French neo-colonialism that has been happening in Burkina Faso, Niger, the mixed bag in Mali, Senegal, and elsewhere. And the current military, who is fairly left leaning, of Burkina Faso, I is stupidly embracing Kagame, and we see similar friendly rapprochements developing between Gabon and Rwanda. Now, Kagame, as everybody should know by now, is a serial liar, is a serial killer, and he's been a Western proxy, particularly of the US, Britain, Israel, and Canada, and its mainly English speaking allies. And now I don't accept entirely the narrative that the French didn't do much to stop the slaughtering in Rwanda. France, though, was clearly a supporter of Juvenal Habyarimana, who more and more evidence the French itself have uncovered that Kagame murdered him and his Burundian counterpart, President Cyril. Now, this pokes holes that Kagame was the savior of Rwanda, and given his endless aggression in Congo and meddling in Congolese affairs and efforts to balkanize and divide and conquer Congo, Zaire, DRC, do you see any red flags or severe limitations to Gabon's military's anti-French colonialism? Because our good friend of the show, Yves Engler, the brilliant Canadian historian, media critic, and geocritic, anti-imperialist thinker and campaigner, and the author of Canada and Africa: 300 Years of Exploitation. When talking with him, he has said that while there's been a lot of talk of the African Spring in these French neo-colonial outposts, the talk has mostly been limited to French imperialism and not showing a lot of hostility to Anglo-American Canadian imperialism, their mining industries, their fossil fuels industries, and Kagame himself has shown that he wants to be very much part of the England-led Commonwealth. So I'm curious your response to that when we talk about Gabon and even some of the other anti-French rebellions that we've been seeing in Africa lately.
Yeah, that was a concern among some that it was only anti-French and not anti-American. But what has happened is that, particularly in Niger, for example, where they had at least one, perhaps two U.S. Drone stations, they've been dismantled, and U.S. troops have left the country. Similar situation in Mali. The U.S. took the position that if there were Russian military advisors in the country, they would not want to participate. But in Gabon, the situation has been that even though the government, a pro-French government, was overthrown, we have not heard the same type of anti-French rhetoric in regard to its domestic and foreign policy. And there has not been any anti-U.S. rhetoric as well. And the U.S. has not taken a position.
With respect to Gabon, you mean?
Yeah, with respect to Gabon.
Okay.
Yeah, they have not, as far as I know, requested the removal of French and U.S. troops from the country. Now, they have suggested that they may want the French troops to leave the country, but their overall policy, it appears not to be anti-French in the same sense as the AES and some other states on the continent who were former French colonies. So it remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen. But eventually, all of these states are going to have to attack U.S. imperialism because that is the main enemy of the peoples of the world. Kwame Nkrumah, 6 decades ago in 1965, in his book entitled Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, clearly identifies the United States as the principal neo-colonial power in the world. So they are the principal enemies of freedom, justice, liberation, and socialism internationally. So even though Gabon at this point may want to remain in the French orbit of influence, they may want to remain in the U.S. sphere of influence, but in order to really improve the conditions of the people there, they're going to have to challenge the U.S. imperialist dominance over Africa and the entire world.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in regard to Rwanda, you mentioned, there it's a complicated situation because their military appears to be stronger than a lot of other military forces in the region. If you look at what happened in Mozambique in the north several years ago, when there was an insurgency that called itself, interestingly enough, quote, Al-Shabaab, unquote, although they're not related to the Al-Shabaab out of Somalia, they agreed to deploy troops in the Cabo Delgado region in the north of Mozambique to fight against these rebels in defense of the Mozambican government. And they did make some headways against them. Also, recently, if you noticed, they had announced that they were going to participate in escorting the Southern African Development Community peacekeeping forces out of the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is really, really amazing if you consider the fact that the M23 rebels, it has been reported, are backed, by the Rwandan government. And also the reports that the former president, Kabila, Joseph Kabila, is in Goma. I haven't been able to substantiate that, but
yes,
that is the report.
No.
They're talking about lifting
it's true. No, he's been accused by the current Felix Tshisekedi government of Congo of engaging in treason and stuff like that,
Right,
and and other forms of corruption. I think this is a faction of the Congolese really trying to get at the heart of why Rwanda has been so powerful and why there's been an inability to push back
right.
Rwanda's proxies. So Kabila being investigated for that, and him even coming to Congo, I think is a very positive thing. I think it's hilarious how he accuses his accusers of being treasonous when he himself has been in power for such a long period of time, and M23 has only got M23 has only gotten stronger and stronger because of Kabila and his own treasonous behavior during his time in office. That being said, Felix Tshisekedi, there's lots to criticize him about. I think I've done programs with you, I've done programs with Eve Angler, done programs with your fellow Black Agenda Report contributor and Garrison about how Felix Tshisekedi himself is also not the leftist he claims he has, is not the champion of Congolese people as he claims to be, given M23 is still being very strong and the army seems to be incapable of pushing him back. But that being said, I think Kabila has done many crimes against the Congolese state. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what this investigation is going to bring, if it's allowed to even if the Congolese judiciary is allowed to do its work, I think it's going to be quite interesting what they'll you know what they'll uncover. So
Yeah, I really am opposed to the intervention of the U.S. State Department, ostensibly attempting to negotiate, and they've already signed an agreement between the foreign ministries of Rwanda and the DRC, supposedly for some type of disengagement in exchange for access to critical minerals and security on the part of the United States
exactly.
to guard those mining interests. But my question is, who is going to represent the security force? Is it going to be the U.S. military, or is it going to be some type of private military army? And Trump has mentioned over the last several months that he wants to create a 20,000 person private army. I don't know if it's going to be headed by Prince, the guy who headed the former Blackwater outfit. He could send mercenaries, thousands of them, to
Oh
Eastern
yeah,
Democratic Republic of Congo.
he's been doing a lot of shady activities in Latin America, particularly Venezuela, and I think, but my friends Orinoco Tribune will correct me if I'm wrong. Bolivia and Peru itself.
Right.
So and
Yeah, they're a great.
and also, I also don't trust UN peacekeeping troops when it comes to bringing about any peace in the
It hasn't happened.
in Congo, given that much of the UN peacekeeping troops are always in the influence of the United States, Britain, and France itself, which has never been one you can trust. Certainly not in African affairs. This would probably be something where despite the heads of states of many African countries, including yours truly, Gabon, but this is one where I would rather have the African Union taking care of this and finding a just peace and finding just a peace settlement, and not any Western influence, and certainly not Western influence that can tie the arms of UN member states to do its endless bidding and colonialism, either out in the open or even behind the scenes and so forth. So,
Yeah, I agree. And the problem is that the national army in Congo apparently has broken down, particularly in the eastern region of the country. So it'd be very difficult for the Southern African Development Community peacekeeping forces to maintain law and order in the area when the Congolese national forces are not in a position to take the lead in that struggle. So it's really a bad, and the United Nations peacekeeping forces Monesco, I believe that's the name of it, uh, had a lot of opposition. People were demonstrating against them. These are rank and file grassroots people in North and South Kivu, as well as the government in Kinshasa. I had asked them to leave as well. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens over the next few months in North and South Kivu in the Eastern DRC, if they're able to maintain stability, and what will the ultimate role of the United States be in resolving this conflict, if they can resolve it. If it's anything like the other geopolitical conflicts, it's going to be a disaster. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. This is Trump who
Or
told
even
people in the United
Haiti, and
States.
or even Haiti. I mean, another red flag about UN peacekeeping troops is
Right,
look at what the UN did
in
in Haiti.
Haiti.
In
Exactly.
Haiti, what it's currently doing in the Haiti in the aftermath of multiple coups, first against RSC, but even I mean the murder of Jovenel Moise
Yes.
was clearly was clearly an inside job. One faction of the elites doing the bidding of whomever is their puppet masters. And if this makes a lot of people's heads spinning and they're thinking, what are you guys talking about? It just goes to show you Western imperialism is literally the root of all evil, and we have to do everything in our power to mobilize against it. Which also means, a plug for Black Alliance for Peace. One of their big major campaigns is AFRICOM out of Africa, U.S. and its allies out of Africa, and that does not mean that overnight Gabon will be a peaceful, prosperous country that will do that will address the grievances of its majority poor people. But imperialism, given what it is, it will certainly be a step in the right direction to get all of those Europe. Pan European imperialists, as well as the U.S., Brits, and France, and so forth, out of Africa and so forth. So
There's a rumor circulating. Well, not necessarily a rumor. I read it in a publication that there was some discussion about merging AFRICOM with the European Command. Now, whether this will happen, I'm not sure. But Langley has been making a lot of noise recently, perhaps to justify the continued existence of AFRICOM, which was started some 18 years ago, and no, actually, yeah, 17 years ago in February of 2008. So yes, we'll see what happens with AFRICOM, but even if it is liquidated and merged with the European Command, it'll still have the same role of imperialism, of destabilization and dominance of African resources and labor.
exactly. And the final thing I'll also say is, when you hear European leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, who basically is the queen of the European Union, when you hear somebody like Emmanuel Macron and so forth, when a lot of those leaders and even those of of the fake left, the social imperialist left, of Europe, when they talk about a European army and so forth, it's basically NATO on steroids or restructuring NATO in order to be that, and that is going to make more, and that's going to mean that's going to be more Libyas and so forth, more Libyas and stuff like that, and more neo-colonialism through through if not color revolutions, then this new European army and so forth like that. And Canada, the last Liberal Party leadership race, there was lots of talk amongst these fake anti-Americanists that Canada, what we need to do is we need to be much more engaged with our European allies, the EU, and we need to be much more engaged with with our Commonwealth and so forth, and we need to have a Five Eyes, but not with the U.S. in it. So that should so for people who are involved in anti-imperialist movements and so forth, they need to monitor language like that and really and say to the peace movement and to African solidarity groups that we need to step our game up, because if those heads of states and the factions of the elites are talking like that, that means they want even more aggression in in the state of affairs of Africa and whatnot, and we cannot let them do that. We have to mobilize like hell against it if we are ever to see a place like Gabon and all of Africa really be prosperous and really addressing the needs of its poor majority peoples. So
Yeah, and King Charles III, his recent trip to Canada, where he laughed at Donald Trump. Somebody mentioned Trump, and he said, "Don't make me laugh." So I think this is a clear signal that there is going to be a reconfiguration of the imperialist camp, and I believe that Trump's efforts to reconfigure it could backfire on the U.S. It very well could, because if there's a huge economic downturn in the United States, which the potential is very, very much there right now. He's going back and forth on the tariffs. You got the divisions within the U.S. State itself, the judiciary, over what he's doing is illegal or not legal. So yeah, we'll see what happens. But there is going to be a broader international anti-imperialist movement. What shape it's going to take remains to be seen, because with the imperialists attempting to reconfigure their structures, the movement itself is going to have to step up its efforts to not only stop Trump, but to stop all the other imperialist powers as well. Look what happened a week ago when the British High Court decided that the people from the Chagos Islands do not have a right of return. So they just took those islands 60 years ago. Diego Garcia, the largest of them, was set up as a U.S. military base when they were bombing Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others. And so this new deal, ostensibly to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which is in the Indian Ocean, which is part of the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, but they maintain control over Diego Garcia. And the British Prime Minister,
yeah,
Keir Starmer, said, yes, this is good because we still maintain our military capability. Trump said it was good because the U.S. still maintains its military capability in the Chagos Islands. And people speculated could be nuclear weapons that are being stored on that island. Who knows? But the fact is that they rolled out this sham agreement in order to maintain their military presence in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa in order to attack other countries in the global south.
unbelievable. And funnily enough, I actually had yesterday I had no the day before yesterday I had just finished reading a book of John Pilger's all about his home country of Australia called The Secret Country, and John Pilger did a fantastic documentary. If people want to know all about Diego Garcia, he did a fantastic documentary called Stealing a Nation, which is all about that. And unbelievable that the situation has gotten unimaginably worse for the people of Diego Garcia. So we have to definitely follow that and do more mobilization to say that this is completely unacceptable. So
Exactly.
well, we were joined on this All Things Africa edition, learning about the history and current affairs of Gabon with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, and Pan-Africanist leftist and all-round anti-imperialist and supporter of people power, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Check out his work, folks, and all of his appearances on 1+1. Subscribe to Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports and donate generously to them. Don't forget to do the same for 1+1 and donate to us, please, and share widely all of 1+1's content and encourage others to like us and again share and donate. The next country we'll be exploring is Cameroon, so join us next week for that. But until then, have a great weekend, folks. Good night and good luck, and yes, and all my best till then.